A drone entered the wreck of the USS Arizona. That's the claim you've probably seen floating around. Mysterious footage, something never shown to the public. Cameras going where no one was supposed to look. It sounds like exactly the kind of story this channel loves. Except when you actually dig into what happened, the real story turns out to be stranger, quieter, and honestly more moving than the clickbait version. So let's talk about what's actually been going into the USS Arizona, who's been sending it in there, and why what they found matters a lot more than any secret footage ever could. On April 1st, 2024, in Grass Valley, California, a man named Lou Conter died at the age of 102. He was the last surviving crewman of the USS Arizona, and with his death, something ended that can never be brought back. There is nobody alive today who stood on that deck. Nobody who heard the air raid sirens. Nobody who watched the forward magazines detonate at 8:06 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, and felt the ship come apart beneath them in about 7 seconds. Lou Conter was the last one, and beneath the ship he escaped, in about 40 feet of water on the floor of Pearl Harbor, lie the remains of roughly 900 sailors and Marines who were never recovered. Here's the thing about the Arizona that most people don't fully register. It isn't a museum piece. It's a war grave. Federally designated, legally protected, still actively used as a burial site to this day. And for more than 15 years, vehicles have been going inside that ship. Not tourists, not treasure hunters, not some rogue drone operator sneaking past security in the middle of the night. The National Park Service has been sending remotely operated vehicles into the wreck, carefully, professionally, with full authorization, in partnership with the United States Navy. The unit responsible is called the Submerged Resources Center, based, oddly enough, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, nowhere near an ocean. They work hand in hand with US Navy Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 1. And what they've documented inside those flooded compartments over the past decade and a half is some of the most extraordinary underwater archaeology in the country. To understand why any of this matters, you need to understand what the Arizona actually was. She was a Pennsylvania-class battleship, launched in 1915, commissioned in 1916, 608 feet long, displacing about 31,400 tons. By 1941, she was already one of the older battleships in the Pacific Fleet, armed with 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, carrying a crew of around 1,500. On the morning of the attack, she was moored along Battleship Row, alongside the repair ship USS Vestal. She took 4 armor-piercing bomb hits. The first 3 were serious but survivable. The fourth, at 8:06 a.m., went through the forward deck and detonated near the forward magazines. The explosion tore the front third of the ship apart in seconds. The bridge, the forward command spaces, the 2 forward turrets, all of it was lifted and collapsed into the harbour. By the time the attack ended, 1,177 of the 1,512 men aboard that morning were dead. Nearly half of all American deaths that day came from this one ship. Salvage crews went to work the following year, but the Arizona was beyond saving. Her hull was too compromised, her forward sections unrecognizable. The Navy pulled what it could reach, the deck guns, 2 of the 3 masts, accessible equipment, and then made the decision to leave the rest exactly where it was. The hull stayed, the lower decks stayed, and so did the men who had died in the compartments the divers couldn't get to. That's the ship the National Park Service inherited. And in 1962, the memorial you've probably seen pictures of was built directly above her, a 184-foot white concrete structure designed by the Austrian-American architect Alfred Priess, spanning the hull amidships without ever touching it. Priess had himself been interned on Sand Island, Hawaii, as an enemy alien during the early years of the war, and he designed the memorial deliberately to sag in the middle and rise at each end, a shape meant to represent a moment of defeat giving way, eventually, to peace. The shrine room at its eastern end carries the engraved names of all 1,177 men who died aboard her. Over the following decades, the wreck picked up layer after layer of federal protection. A National Historic Landmark designation in 1989, additional protection under the Sunken Military Craft Act in 2004, a redesignation as Pearl Harbor National Memorial in 2019. Today, unauthorized diving on the Arizona is a federal crime. unauthorized entry with any kind of vehicle is a federal crime. Which is exactly why the only footage that exists from inside that ship has come from one source: the people with the legal authority to be there. The first real archaeological survey of the wreck began in 1983, led by Daniel Lenihan, the founding chief of the Submerged Resources Center, working alongside Larry Murphy, and again, Navy divers. That survey ran for 3 years and produced the first detailed measurements and drawings of the ship as she actually sat on the harbour floor. And it turned up something nobody expected: 2 of the Arizona's massive 14-inch guns still sitting in their original turret positions. Everyone had assumed the wartime salvage had taken them. It hadn't. The paperwork from 1942 and 1943 was compiled in the middle of a war, in a hurry, and it simply never made that loss explicit. 40 years later, divers found the guns were still down there, exactly where they'd been at 8:06 in the morning on December 7th, 1941. The 1989 professional report that came out of that survey, edited by Lenihan, became the foundational archaeological document on the wreck. At the time, the ship as mapped in that report was the largest single object ever documented underwater. The interior work really accelerated in the 2000s, with small professional, remotely operated vehicles, mainly deep trekker platforms built for exactly this kind of confined, delicate work. And this, by the way, is the actual basis for the drone claim you've seen floating around. Not an aerial drone, not a private DIY submersible. A professional ROV deployed by trained federal archaeologists coordinating with Navy divers working the exterior. They use robots instead of human divers for the interior, specifically because the corridors are too narrow and too structurally fragile for a person to safely enter. And because the wreck is a grave, and the protocol calls for the least invasive method possible. Brett Seymour, the Submerged Resources Center's deputy chief and underwater photographer, has been diving on the Arizona for more than 20 years, and his imagery, distributed through Park Service channels, a documentary co-production with CuriosityStream, and publications like Naval History magazine, is the closest thing that exists to a comprehensive visual record of what's currently inside the ship. And what those vehicles found inside is the part that actually stops you. There's a section of the crew galley that survived the explosion almost completely intact. Ceramic bowls still sitting on their shelves. Forks still resting exactly where sailors set them down before an ordinary breakfast that some of them never got to eat. Frozen there by the suddenness of the attack, preserved by 80 years of still dark water. It's one of the most cited images to come out of the entire survey, and it's not because it's shocking. It's because it makes that morning feel close in a way that no report or statistic ever could. The vehicles have also been tracking something with real consequences for the future. The Arizona's hull is dying. The steel has been corroding in salt water for over 80 years, unevenly, some compartments holding, others failing. And she's still carrying roughly 500,000 gallons of bunker fuel oil in her tanks. Oil that's been slowly seeping to the surface this entire time in what the Park Service calls the black tears. If the hull fails catastrophically at some point, rather than corroding gradually, that oil could be released all at once, with real environmental consequences for Pearl Harbor. Without the interior documentation these vehicles have produced, the Park Service wouldn't have any way to track which compartments are most at risk. With it, they can monitor the corrosion compartment by compartment and plan for whatever decision eventually has to be made. There's a more personal layer to all of this too. The Pearl Harbor Survivors Association formally dissolved in December 2011, once its membership dropped below 2,700, and the pool of men who had actually been aboard the Arizona that morning was always far smaller still, a group that aged out at the same rate as every other generation of veterans. By the early 2020s, only a handful remained. In 2017, the team conducted a live ROV survey specifically for a survivor named Donald Stratton, then 95 years old, one of 6 men who'd escaped the burning ship by climbing hand over hand along a line strung from the Vestal. He watched on a monitor live footage of the interior of the ship he'd escaped 76 years earlier. He died in 2020. And there's a formal protocol developed over decades for what happens after. Survivors who choose to can have their ashes carried down by Navy divers and placed inside gun turret number 4 after they die, rejoining the shipmates they left behind. Around 45 men have done this so far. Lou Conter is one of them. So, no, a mysterious drone did not sneak into the USS Arizona and capture footage nobody was ever supposed to see. What actually happened is quieter and, honestly, better. For 15 years, trained federal archaeologists and Navy divers have been carefully, respectfully documenting a war grave, compartment by compartment, using vehicles built for exactly that purpose, and sharing what they find through Park Service publications, documentary partnerships, and naval history journals. The ceramic bowls are real, the rediscovered guns are real, the oil is real, and the 45 survivors who chose to go back down are real. None of it was ever hidden. It just was never sensational enough to make the headlines the way a secret footage story does. The Arizona isn't keeping secrets. She's a grave that the country agreed, a long time ago, to take care of for as long as there's anything left of her to care for. And that work is still going on right now, quietly, 40 years running, long after the last man who remembered that morning has gone. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments, and I'll keep making more of these. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.